Brilliant. Right. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining and welcome to today's PortSwigginar on maximising your usage of Burp Suite Enterprise Edition. A couple of quick introductions and I will turn our video on. Apologies, forgot to do that. Apologies if there's any coughs or splutters. There's a little bit of a cough going around the office, which has already taken out one of our other presenters today. So my name is Adam. I'm part of our customer advocacy team here at PortSwigger. My role is to support organisations with their POCs and working with existing customers, helping them to get the most out of PortSwigger and our products. To my right is Alex.
Yeah, hi folks. My name's Alex. I sit with the technical support team. So we handle the day-to-day support for both professional and enterprise products, and we work with Adam's team in assisting customers both getting started and continuing with their scanning journey.
We've also got a large team in the background today that's manning the Q&A facility. So we've got Sophie, Hannah, James, Kieran, and plenty of others. Please do use this to ask any questions that you've got during the session. We'll try and respond to them all as quickly as possible. If we can't, don't worry. We usually leave between sort of 5 and 10 minutes at the end of the session just open where we can answer any questions. And if we don't get to them during that session, we will follow up. So please just chuck as many questions as you've got into the Q&A and we'll follow up after the event. So just as a quick recap why we're here today. So over the past couple of months, we've been focusing our customer conversations on the challenges that they are facing when rolling out automated DAST scanning within their organisations. So our aim today is to highlight some of those customer conversations, which will hopefully resonate with the attendees on today's call. So, sorry about that. During this session, we're going to be covering deployment of Enterprise Edition and how we recommend that you prepare for that. Alex is going to run a UI demo for those of you who are new to Enterprise Edition and help you get to grips with using the software correctly. Following that, we're going to cover some of the common challenges that I mentioned and best practices for DAST scanning based on those customer conversations that we've been having. Finally, we're going to run through some next steps that we would love for you to take following this session. And as a reminder, please absolutely hammer the Q&A box. Make sure the rest of the team are busy. So we're going to quickly touch on how to deploy Enterprise Edition, the architecture and system requirements. So it's worth mentioning that we've got a mix of customers on the call. Some of you, and by the looks of the poll, will have an active deployment already live, but we'll also have some new customers who have not taken any action with their license to date. So in terms of deployment preparation, prior to installation, we advise that you carefully read our preparing to deploy guidance, which you'll find in the support centre. One of the guys is going to drop that as a chat, thanks Kieran, and we will follow up with a link following the session. This will walk you through everything that you'll need to know about each of the available deployment options, of which there are a few, and allow you to consider what will work best for you and your organisation. Alex is going to go through these options shortly. But we typically see customers taking around 2 to 4 weeks to deploy Enterprise Edition. Often any delays are due to internal constraints, which again I've seen from the poll answers, which is not great to hear, but it's good that we're hearing the same thing, and potentially waiting for any prepared infrastructure to be spun up. Alex is now going to run through deployment options and a high-level overview of system requirements.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, folks. So we'll start out with the deployment options, of which there are two. And this is largely going to come down to either personal preference or kind of the resource that you have available to you. So option one, which is by far kind of the most common option, is just utilising the standard installer. So you can grab this from our release page, depending on the OS that you want to deploy to. There's not much in terms of hard and fast requirements from an OS perspective. Essentially, if it's 64-bit and you can run Java 17, the OS itself should be fine. There's a couple of options around if you deploy to a single machine, which is really just for trial purposes. So once the sort of production stage has been met, we typically expect customers to deploy to the multi-system environment, which is what we're going to cover today. If your preference is more towards containerization, we do have the Kubernetes option available. So this is deploying via our Helm charts that we supply for the application deployment. Again, the notion here is that we want to be as agnostic as possible, so there are a few pre-requirements to meet, but as long as it's an x86-based cluster, you should be able to get up and running on whichever platform you have, be that a cloud provider or private, and then you can take advantage of the auto scaling machines as well. But we do typically advise that if you have no Kubernetes experience, you'll probably be better sticking with the standard installer, just because you will have a smoother time in terms of setup and operation. But if you're capable and confident with the Kubernetes side, then that's a great option as well. System requirements is a big one to mention. You can view this on our website, which I would highly encourage you to do. We're just about to release a kind of revamped system requirements document as well, just to make things as clear and easy to digest as possible. But just kind of anecdotally from a support team perspective, a lot of the queries and tickets that we get in terms of issues typically relate back to under-spec'd machines. So it's very important to make sure that you're hitting, at the very least, the minimum requirement, and preferably the recommended system requirements when it comes to deploying the various components of enterprise. It can be a little bit nuanced because there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to deploying Burp Suite Enterprise, because it does depend on things like how many concurrent scans you're going to be running, what are the size and sort of depth of your applications, are we dealing with SPAs, heavy JavaScript, etc. And I'll just underpin that by saying, once you kind of consume that documentation, if you still have questions, if you need guidance, you can reach out to the support team and we will help you with determining what those system requirements will look like. So from a standard installer perspective, an architecture for a multi-machine deployment, this is what it's going to look like. So the enterprise server and web server always live together on one machine. That can be physical or virtual. It can live in a cloud environment. So if you're interested in deploying to EC2, Azure VM, GCP, absolutely fine. You can still use a standard installer in that cloud environment. So that, for example, would be one virtual machine for the enterprise server and web server. Then you'll have one or more scanning machines. This is just going to depend on your concurrency in terms of how many scans you want to support. Again, this links back to that system requirements documentation, which will determine how many scans you can run per machine, how many machines ultimately you will need. And those scanning machines will talk back to the enterprise server over port 8072. Those of you who trialed might be familiar with the bundled H2 database, which is great for the trial, but for production environments, generally we recommend the external database. Especially as you scale, you'll find this is more performant and more supporting of what you're trying to achieve at scale. Again, the types of database that we support are in the system requirements documentation, but again, that will typically deploy externally to its own machine, along with those scanning machines. We've got some egress and ingress there as well. So an important one is the connection to PortSwigginar.net via port 443. This is for license activation, which is a requirement. There is no offline activation available. That can be proxied if required, and it's also how we deliver the automated updates. If you have those enabled, manual updates are supported offline. The scanning machine will naturally want to talk to the target application, so by default these are going to be over the HTTP and S ports, and that goes hand in hand with Burp Collaborator. Those of you who are Burp Suite professional users might be familiar with Collaborator. It works in the same way for enterprise as a public service that the scanning machines by default will want to access along with the target applications. This is for additional functionality with your scanning. It's not a strict requirement, but we certainly do encourage its use if possible. And then finally, how your users access the system. So it's a centrally deployed architecture, so we can have lots of teams, lots of users accessing the same central web server, which will link to the enterprise server. So we'll cover in the demo, but here we want to configure the web server URL import that those users can access from wherever they are, internal network, external network, and then if your preference is API clients, that's how they connect as well. For those who are interested in the Kubernetes deployment, again, we've tried to kind of remain as agnostic as possible. So we provide the Helm chart that deploys the application, but the cluster setup needs to be done before that application can be deployed. And we say you need these three things. So you will need to set up an ingress solution. So typically that's going to be a load balancer or ingress controller, a persistent volume claim, so application name -PVC, whatever application name you give it, and that has to be shared by all the nodes in the namespace. And then we want to take advantage of that auto scaling for the scanning machines, so we don't have to pre-provision them. They're created as and when needed, so the cluster auto scaler must be installed and enabled as well. Again, we've got all of the Kubernetes deployment documentation available, so please do give that a read if you're interested in the Kubernetes side of things. This is what the architecture looks like from a Helm chart sort of versus the cluster perspective. So everything within a Helm chart is deployed for you. Web server pod, enterprise service, enterprise server pod, and then ultimately the scanning pods once those jobs are created. Same kind of connectivity from an ingress perspective. But you'll also need that ingress solution that the users can connect to access the enterprise server itself. And we're still talking about the concept of an external database for which we provide those setup scripts for.
Apologies, I'm going to have a big cough before we continue so I don't irritate anyone. Sorry about that. So, before we step into the UI that Alex is going to run through, we wanted to, and when we cover the foundations of Enterprise Edition, it's probably worth highlighting what customers are telling us about their journeys with automated DAST scanning. It's all fairly obvious, but hopefully you'll hear something that resonates with you. If we follow this journey from right to left on the screen as it is, we have security teams using Burp Suite Pro for their quarterly annual pen tests, who are now actively shifting to this middle area where they're introducing automated scanning across their portfolio of applications using the scheduled scan feature with Enterprise Edition. So this is great as it often frees up the security team's time to work on the more critical issues, and since its launch, we felt that this was the primary use case for Enterprise Edition. The conversation is now changing, however, and more customers want to integrate DAST into a CI/CD pipeline as we shift further onto that left-hand side of the screen, as a way of catching those issues earlier on in the software development lifecycle. These pipeline scans are then supplemented with regular weekly or monthly scans, often deeper scans, effectively covering all bases. So you might run a quicker, lightweight scan as part of a pipeline scan, and then using the deeper scan configurations to make sure that you're catching every vulnerability within the app. Some of you may have seen this logo before, but just to quickly touch on Dastardly. Dastardly is a free, lightweight web application security scanner for your CI/CD pipeline from Burp Suite. It's designed specifically for web devs, and it checks your application for 7 security issues that are likely to be of interest to them during software development. If you're not quite ready, or you're potentially not at this stage yet for CI/CD integration with Enterprise Edition, this is a great way to bridge that gap with your developers, help them secure their builds earlier, and hopefully enable in the future them to get fully on board with the concept of integrating all of their scans, all of their builds with a full scan from Enterprise Edition. We're hoping to run a future session on Dastardly, specifically in the new year, where we'd love for you to attend and to learn more. So Alex is now going to take you through those Enterprise Edition foundations. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Had. Okay, folks. So, I mean, from an installation and setup perspective, once you hit the home screen, the UI, the view will be slightly different for you because you've been kind of taken through the in-product hand-holding of getting set up, and there's some quick links to take a look up and follow. So that'd be this page here. It's got all sorts of information in it about getting set up, about starting the site configuration, about scans, links to all the documentation and integration, etc. So I very much encourage you to explore this quick links page when you're first getting set up. In terms of what we'll just go through in the UI today, it's just going to be that foundational knowledge and some tips and tricks on getting the most out of those initial scans. So actually my first kind of port of call, again, once you've installed, once you've hit that UI, and maybe you pass some of that initial quick scan elements, is to jump into the networks component of the settings. So this is where your web server settings are going to sit. And these are important to be completed because any either users or applications that want to come into Enterprise externally are going to utilize these settings. So it's important that we get those set kind of from the get-go to avoid any confusion later on. So the web server URL itself, which by default at installation might just be sort of localhost port 8080, but you can configure a TLS cert to secure that connection, and then use something like a fully qualified domain name to access the web server. So we'll have our URL with the port appended, and then underneath that, the web server port itself. We can toggle on the use of TLS and upload a P12 certificate for those secure connections. And if we require a proxy server, one for that license activation that we spoke around, and also for automatic updates, we can add those proxy configurations here. Just to be clear, this is nothing in regards to scanning. That is handled separately. This is just for talking to PortSwigginar.net, where maybe you don't normally allow an external connection to be allowed. So that's a quick bit of networking out of the way. Next step might be to explore setting up our team, or at least some initial users. So you log in with your admin account, and you probably want to get some other permissions set up. So it's all role-based access control. The basic premise is that we create these roles that we want. There are some built-in ones, so you can see there: scan initiator, scan results editor, but you have complete control to go in and customize those roles as you see fit. So you've got access to all the permissions, so split into things like sites, scans, scanning machines, the team itself, settings. So you can really restrict or enhance a user's permissions based on your own requirements. Just close those. And once we've got our roles set up, those roles are typically assigned to groups, and then you assign those users to your groups. So very much a team-focused product. Again, you can have some inbuilt ones there, but you're free to create your own. And then we can further start to restrict site views on that basis. So everything is handled on a site basis within Enterprise. So if you do have particular teams and you want them looking after their own sites and not necessarily viewing or interfering with other sites, this is where you would adhere those restrictions.
It's probably worth remembering as well, if you were not part of the original procurement or trial of Enterprise Edition, that users are unlimited within the product. There's no restrictions there. So again, we encourage you to get as many of your colleagues added at this stage.
Absolutely, and if your preference is more around single sign-in login, so if we jump into settings here and integrations, perhaps something for further down the line, but you can set up LDAP and SAML integration so we can pass across existing groups from your identity providers that may or may not already exist. So we can handle login and authentication and permissions on that basis as well, if that's your preference. Again, all of that is documented from a process perspective. But let's dive into creating a site. So as I mentioned, everything is site-based with Enterprise. Much like the team basis that Adam mentioned there, there's no limits as to how many sites that you add to the application. The license just applies to those concurrent scans. So don't feel like you need to be careful in terms of how many sites I'm adding here. Feel free to add as many as you like. We have the bulk import template. So if you need to get up and running with a lot of sites quickly, you can complete that template and then import it, and I'll populate all those details for you. I actually encourage you just to play around with a couple of sites first. Make sure that you've got a few scans under your belt before you start sort of importing en masse, just so you can get used to what those site settings look like, what are important in terms of the configuration, and that we're getting good scanning results. So if you go to new site, we can see on the left we've already kind of got a folder structure underway. But again, it's a great way to organize all of the applications. Might be on a team basis, might be on a geographical basis. But we can create that folder structure and assign our sites to that. And again, maybe restrict the permissions on that basis as well. But we can give our site a name. We'll just call this test site. And if we need to do any sort of tagging, a particular user against a particular site or naming convention, we can add that into the site name as well, just to make search and identification a bit easier. And then we can move on to our site scope, which is a very important component of scanning with Enterprise. So the basic premise is that we want to provide our initial URL to target in terms of our scan. And then when we kick off a scan, all of the subdirectories of that URL will be scanned by default. So for any pro users that might be used to things like the sitemap or navigating manually, This being a DAST scanner, this being automated, we really just want to point and let Enterprise do its thing. So typically most of your sites might just look like and then we're going to go away and scan the whole application. But we can be more specific than that in terms of the site path. So if you want to restrict that to a particular directory, we can specify that directory in the main site URL. So maybe that's just home, and then we're adding another slash on the end. That means we're just specifically scanning that directory. Or maybe we want to leave it open. And just to mention, everything will be default HTTP and S. Or if we specify a specific protocol, we can scan just using that protocol, if that's all that's available. But if we jump down in here into additional and excluded URLs, we can customize that site scope further. So typically with the included URLs, what we're doing here is there might be components of the application that belong to our app, but don't fall under that main site URL, so might actually be classed as out of scope because we've not added anything but just that site URL. So we could potentially add that here. It's good for calling out things like API definitions, because again, sometimes they might not fall under the same host domain as our site URL, so we can add that to the included URLs. And similarly for excluded, the bits that we don't want to scan, maybe we just don't want to scan it because it's not of interest to us. Maybe it's something like a logout button that we don't want to be clicking on, so we can add those URLs to the excluded list. Generally speaking, again, as an automated scanner, we want to kind of let Enterprise do its thing, so we don't necessarily want to be populating these with huge URL lists, but certainly have a play around with that scope, and you'll soon get to grips with it on that basis. Again, all of this is documented if you need to read up on it. Once we've got our scope set, we can move on to our scan settings. So the first main component is going to be the scan configuration itself. And there's two options here: the preset scan mode, which is designed to get you up and running as quick as possible, and then the custom configuration mode, which once you're comfortable with the kind of preset scan modes, or your site needs some very specific behaviors applied, then we can start tinkering with custom configurations. So we can start out with something like a lightweight scan, which is capped at 15 minutes. That's just going to give you a quick snapshot of the security posture of that application. Maybe it's a daily scan that we want to run. And then we can move up the board fast, which is again biased towards speed, but isn't capped. Balanced, a good sweet spot between coverage and speed. And then deep, where we're trying to gain that ultimate understanding of a site security posture. Longer crawl, more thorough audit. And I would just encourage you to kind of cycle through all of these. One thing to mention is that when we're trying to build out that security posture over time, which is certainly achievable with the notion of doing everything on a site basis, and you'll see from the sites page for each app, we're building out those graphs over time. If you keep changing scan configurations under the same site, it is going to skew those results because we're playing with very different parameters. So if you do want to chop and change scan configurations, if that's at the start and you're just testing and playing around, or later on you need to make a change to a scan configuration for whatever reason, sometimes it's better actually just to create a new site, same details, but just add that altered scan configuration. So again, we're not affecting those results over time. That's a preset scan mode. We will come to the custom mode a little bit later on. But next we can move on to application logins if we need authentication for our site. This is where we can add those, and we have two options: adding username and passwords. If you've got a really basic single page form, username, password, this is the best option to use because that's going to be the quickest in terms of the scan when we're finding that form and then just submitting those credentials and logging in. Then we can discover all of the authenticated content. For anything more complex, we would look to our recorded login sequence, which we're going to talk in a little bit more detail now around authenticated targets. So as we know, in terms of the sort of modern web application landscape, with authentication, and we're getting sort of increasingly complex with those methods, SSO, multi-factor authentication, kind of moving away from that simple single HTML form for logins. So we do get a lot of questions around this. I've got complex login sequences. How do I navigate those? How do I know that the scanner has used an authentication that I've applied successfully? And again, another common one is around multi-factor or two-factor authentication. So if any of these are kind of top of your mind as well, recorded login sequence is usually the answer to these types of questions. And we'll take you through an example now of how to create and apply one. Just specifically on the MFA side, so recorded login sequence does not support 2FA, MFA. We always recommend that those mechanisms are disabled for the purposes of scanning. And the reason for that is that we log in a lot during a scan. We're trying to navigate these paths and create that sort of map of what we're looking at from an application basis and what we want to audit. So it's not just one long single session. And therefore, as you would imagine, having to apply multiple dynamically generated codes throughout an automated scan is not an easy mechanism or practical one to support. So again, we recommend that's disabled as a mechanism for scanning. Maybe you just make a test account specific for the use of logging into your applications during scans. So we'll just give a quick example. Hang on a second here. So we're going to use the example of this application here. It's a deliberately vulnerable test app with a two-stage sign-in mechanism. So that's again something that would be suitable to the recorded login process. If we go back to our enterprise site, we're looking to generate a JSON script to add to the recorded login here. If you click on the link to the documentation, this is going to take you through in much more detail around authentication, best practices, and I would highly encourage you to read that as well, but also how to install the plugin that we have. So you'll require the recorded login plugin here. So if we just come back, navigate to our login URL. So recorded login is designed to handle redirections outside of what your scope might be. So another great benefit of recorded login is if you do have things like SSO redirects, once you hit your login page, you're taken somewhere else, you authenticate, you come back. That's all ignored essentially from a scope perspective when a recorded login is playing. So we don't need to do things like add those SSO logins with the huge URLs into our inclusive rules because the recorded login is bypassing that for us. So once a plugin is installed, we can click new recording and that'll spit us out into an incognito session because that is just how we would log in during a scan. We can navigate to our initial URL. Everything inside of the red box is what is being recorded. So you need to be very deliberate in terms of your actions when recording. We don't want additional clicks. We don't want additional keyboard taps, etc. Because that is going to be reflected on our script and probably cause errors when we're trying to replay the script. But you can just log in as you normally would. So we'll do test.com, enter that password, sign in. It's recorded that whole flow, as well as any redirects that we might have occurred. Once we hit that home page, we don't want to navigate anywhere else. We don't want to click log out. We've hit that home page, which is what we want the scanner to do, our base URL that we've provided for that site URL, and now we can stop recording. That will generate the JSON script for us, so we can now add that to the recorded login sequence, give it a label, because that will be saved, and then click save. By default, we will no longer be able to view the script. It has those credentials in it, so just from a permissions perspective, that is disabled by default. If you want your user to be able to review and even edit those, there is a permission available for that. But now that's been applied, assuming we were scanning that particular website as our main site URL, that authentication will be handled for us with the recorded login sequence. In terms of the rest of our site configuration, for those that are pro users, you'll be familiar with extensions. But for those that are new, extensions are available from the BAT store. Again, we can provide the link to that. Extensions are additions to your sites that modify the scan behavior in some way. So one example would be Log4Shell scanner that happened just after Christmas last year. We introduced an extension to handle that scan check. So again, we're just trying to modify the scanner in some way, shape or form. So there's some useful ones on there that you might want to check out, but certainly not a requirement from a site configuration perspective. Scanning pools. So we can organize our scanning machines into pools if we want to dedicate resource Just one typical use case would be, I've got my sort of daily, weekly automated DAST scans. They might get assigned to one scan pool that consists of a few scanning machines. I know they're always going to be taken care of. And I've got my CI/CD scans that might sit in another pool that the devs are using to kick off ad hoc pipeline builds. And then the two sort of resources don't bleed over. And then if we've configured either SMTP server in our settings or Slack notifications, we can specify users that we want to notify of scan progress as well. And that's it, we've created our site. We could then perform a pre-scan check, which is available for all new sites and sites that already exist. So for starters, we're going to run a connection check against the URL that you've provided, and hopefully we'll get a 200 OK, so we know that the scanning machine can reach that target application and there's going to be no issues with the scan. If there is a problem, you'll get some remediation advice and the response code related to that. So it might be that maybe we've not added our proxy configuration details for the scanning machine to reach the target application. Maybe it's a client TLS cert. There can be many reasons that we could address there. Same for the recorded login. If we've applied a recorded login, we can run the pre-scan check. It'll play it for us and then provide a series of screenshots that we can run through. And we can observe if the authentication has been successful or not, so that we know when we run a scan, we can log in okay. Again, if there are any problems, it'll throw out some remediation advice, and then you can address that. And ultimately, if you need to, you can always contact my team at support to help you with those two checks. Then it's a case of kicking off your scan once you've created your first site. So once you've created a site, you can go to new scan, and then maybe you've built out a site tree, maybe you've just got the one site, but then you can select from that site tree the application that you want to scan. Because it's all site-based, we're just going to pull through all of that configuration data every time we want to scan. Typically, we're going to schedule this based on your own requirements, so the start date and time, and then we can repeat that process again based on your own schedule. So daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the case may be. Set up multiple sites for the same application and have a schedule across multiple data points. That's absolutely no problem. And we can run an ad hoc scan as well if we're just getting started and testing, etc. Once that's been kicked off, it'll be assigned to an available scanning machine or pool if that's what you've got configured. And then we can observe the scan in the timeline if we want to. So once the scan starts, we'll observe the crawling phase. We can see how many requests we're making, the URLs we're looking at, etc. And then we'll move into the audit phase once the crawling is done. We're actually carrying out the scan checks and auditing the locations that we've discovered. Once that scan has run, and you can start to assess the results, so this is the same application for a previously run scan, and we can start to look at the issues that have been populated. So all based on severity level and confidence, so high, medium, low, or informational, and we can filter on that basis certain firm tentative or a false positive that we've marked. But if we drill down into a particular issue, we get our advisory, which is going to give you all the background information around that particular vulnerability, remediation advice. There'll be a reference to our Web Security Academy, very useful one for developers as well. If you're running those pipeline scans, sandbox environments to carry out the same kind of payloads as well. And then our CWE classifications for the vulnerability. We can view the request and the response for the payload. And if after further investigation, we decide we want to mark this as a false positive, and we can do so, and we can propagate that to future scans as well, so it's not being flagged every single time. We can mark it as that false positive. Adam, are we happy that we've covered the basics and we can?
Yeah, we can crack on, no problem. So yeah, as we mentioned around customer conversations, obviously rise of single page apps has gone hand in hand with increasing reliance on APIs and microservices, increasing number of customers looking to scan these types of apps as part of their portfolio. Traditionally, these types of applications have been very difficult for automated scanners to navigate due to their complexity, highly dynamic, and to ensure you get the maximum coverage across your SPAs, you'll need to ensure that scan configs have been set up in the correct way. So we're not necessarily going to cover exactly how the scanner navigates an SPA or improvements that we're making to an SPA to the scanner in terms of its capabilities with SPAs, we ran a session in October with Alex Borshik. It's available on our YouTube channel, which was specifically on the scanner's capabilities and what we're going to be working on in 2023 with relation to SPAs. But those customer questions on the screen at the moment. So how do we effectively navigate an SPA? How do I know in terms of how much coverage I'm going to get across that application? These are all things that we're actively working with. It's not something that we're ever going to stop working on, I don't think, with SPAs, but there are things that we can do in the product at the moment, which Alan's going to show you, that will increase your chances of coverage across an SPA.
So with single page apps, I think one of the kind of main underpins is just going back to what we talked around at the start with system requirements. Just due to the nature of single page applications, they do tend to be quite intensive from a scanning perspective. So kind of phase one is just hitting those recommended system requirements from both an enterprise and a scanning machine perspective, because you'll find if your system is underpowered, scanning performance will suffer, and particularly in relation to SPAs, we see this quite often, where it's just simply struggling to cover the application in any sort of depth. So that's definitely kind of point one. We mentioned before on the preset scan modes, and again, I definitely encourage you to try those, especially as you're just starting out. But with SPAs, this could be potentially where we start to kind of bleed into the custom scan configurations. So you can build out your own library of custom configs, and there can be lots of different reasons to use the custom configuration. So if you go to settings and scan configs, you'll have a whole bunch of inbuilt ones that we provide, and then you add your own as kind of time progresses. So we can see here, again, it's just sort of centered around either the audit or the crawl, or maybe we're minimizing false positives. But if we go to new configuration, it gives you all the options that are available from a scan configuration perspective, and you can start to tweak these. And this is typically what we would suggest in regards to an SPA. So as a starting point, we jump into crawl optimization here. We want to specify the crawl strategy, certainly as at least a more complete basis, due to what we want to cover in terms of the application, or you may even need to knock that up to most complete for maximum coverage. And we've always seen benefits from this in terms of single page applications. Something like the fastest is not going to be suitable at all, because that's really for static web applications. You're not going to see good results from a fastest crawl strategy with an SPA, and faster is just not enough time to give any sort of balance of coverage. If it is an authenticated application, so just kind of diving back to that recorded login component as well, there's a very useful option here, which is available with some of the preset scan modes. But effectively, if you're only interested in authenticated content, I would highly encourage you to enable this option here as well. So this means we're only ever going to crawl using the credentials that have been applied. So if, say, it's an internal app and it's on your SSO network and you have to log in every time you access the application, I would say, why not use this option? To go back to one of the other questions as well around how do I know I've logged in, this will instantly let you know, because we're going to perform that recorded login. And if we don't crawl any further, you're probably going to see an error in the scan logs that something's gone wrong with the authentication. If we start to crawl, we're discovering new locations, we know we've logged in correctly, but because we've performed that recorded login as a first action. If we come down to auditing, this is where you'll find your issues being reported and the audit optimization. So the audit speed, again, normal isn't necessarily a bad thing in relation to single page applications. It does also link back to what kind of coverage you want from an issues perspective, but there's certainly no harm in clicking thorough, again, when it comes to SPAs, to make sure we're trying to maximize that coverage as best we can. Same goes for the accuracy, if we want to either minimize false negatives or false positives. I imagine most of you are more interested in false positives there. And then some customers like to go by scan type, so these are effectively groupings. So medium active and intrusive active are certainly popular ones for internal apps, because you're looking for kind of the most vulnerable. For sites that might be live or public, maybe passive or light active is more appropriate. But you also have this option to select individual issues. So another great one for SPAs, if you're specifically looking for particular issues, maybe you just want to drop that down to those issues that we can really focus on as opposed to covering the whole breadth of all the issues that we cover. And then I think we've potentially missed one there as well. So SPAs, I'm sure some of you might use this yourself, that they can quite often use fragments. So if you do utilize fragments for your application, you can set this to yes, so effectively telling the scanner that we're going to be looking out for fragments in the URL as a way of navigation. And again, that can typically increase your coverage as well. I'll just close this by saying we've got all of these options documented in terms of what they do and what they mean. So if you're interested in learning more about customization, we'll link those docs, and it explains each option. One we mentioned earlier was this is a lot of connectivity around the scanning machine that we mentioned when we were talking about proxies and enterprise versus scanning machine. So if you've got any requirement around platform auth, so NTLM, basic, digest, i.e. not login pages, this is where you add those credentials. So a good distinction there between recorded login and platform authentication. You apply those on a scan configuration basis and then apply those to your site. Same for proxy servers, we can add those here, or client TLS sets. But again, highly encourage you to explore the documentation around custom configurations.
Just to let everyone know, we've probably got another 5 minutes to go. I appreciate that we said it was going to be a 45-minute session. Apologies if we've run over slightly, but it'd be great if you could all stay with us. We've just got to cover APIs off and then a couple of next steps, but let's run through that.
Here's only a couple of quick points, folks, around scanning APIs. So naturally, API-based architecture is only becoming more popular. I'm sure you're all interested in how to go about scanning your APIs. And we do get these kind of questions, how do I get that set up in my site to scan APIs? What about the definition? How do I know that I'm scanning those APIs correctly? So this just really links back to, one, the site setup, and then there's some kind of prerequisites around API scanning. We'll just come out of that scan configuration, go to new site. So API scanning is enabled by default. You would have to turn it off in a scan configuration for us not to parse any definitions that we locate. But how we locate those definitions is via a URL. So it's an important point to note that the definition must be hosted either somewhere within the application or at a URL that we can include in the scope so that we can locate it and then parse it and derive the endpoints from within. So I'm going to give you a very quick example from Swagger's own website, because that is what we support. OpenAPI specification version 3 for the definitions is a requirement for API scanning. So let's just say this is our application URL. We would take that, add it to our main site URL. That's what we want to scan. And then we've got an example here of a hosted version 3 definition as part of the same application. But we appreciate that might not always be the case, that it is hosted under the same domain as the source application. So if that was the case, I would add that to my included URL. So I'm bringing that definition into scope. So I know that the scanner can locate it and parse it. And in terms of knowing that we have discovered it, once you complete a scan, we'll just come out of the screen a second. We'll go to an older scan. This logging tab is very useful once the scan is either running or complete, just to determine if there are any issues or kind of what's going on. And there will be entries specific to identifying API endpoints within this scan event log if we have successfully located and parsed that definition. So that's kind of what to look out for. And then naturally, the URLs will be populated from that discovery. So that's another method of knowing that we found those locations successfully. Around authentication, again, you've got the option of recorded login if those are locked behind an auth server, or we can do things like add custom headers. Again, we've got documentation around this, and if you need further help, again, just reach out to my team.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So as described earlier, as we said, with customers wanting to shift scanning earlier on in their pipeline, CI/CD driven scans are becoming increasingly popular with Enterprise Edition. We could dedicate a whole session to this topic, and I think we will do in the new year, so we'd love to invite you back. But Alex is just going to quickly whiz through a couple of different options that we have with running a pipeline scan with Enterprise Edition.
Okay, folks. So once Enterprise is set up, the premise of pipeline scans is quite straightforward. We're inserting some sort of command into our pipeline that is linking back to our Enterprise instance here. So scans are still running and populating data within our central repository via the use of a driver that we would install or make available to those pipeline commands. We're giving the awareness to the pipeline of what the scan is doing, what it's finding, so that it can fail it based on the thresholds that you set. So I'm just going to give a very quick example of Jenkins. Again, it doesn't really matter what platform you use because we do have an agnostic driver available for this. If I just jump into Jenkins as an example here, once I've added the plugin, in the specific case of Jenkins, I get some additional build steps. If I just scroll all the way down here, add build step, Burp site-driven scan, and Burp scan. We primarily recommend site-driven scan because, again, Enterprise is largely site-driven, so we can pull all of that config data across. But in the case of pipeline scans, the premise is the same, whether we're using the Jenkins plugin or the generic driver. We're connecting back to our Enterprise server. We're utilizing an API key that's been generated from an Enterprise API user. So that gives us that authenticated connection back to Enterprise. The driver gives Jenkins the awareness, or our platform, of that site tree. So we can specify a site. In the case of the UI here, I just pick one from the list. With the generic driver, which I'll show in a second, we specify a site ID. And then we say, well, when do we want the build to fail? Under what threshold? So it might be high and certain confidence ratings for those vulnerabilities. We could even permit a number of issues. And then, important one from a developer perspective, we can generate a copy of that report without even having to go into the Enterprise UI. We can specify where we want that stored, and it will be retrievable once the scan has complete. And then anytime we build that particular pipeline, we're kicking off a scan against that site, and we can monitor that in the console output. In regards to the generic driver, again, the premise is exactly the same. And I can use that with Jenkins as well, but I've just built out a command instead. This could be within a pipeline rather than a freestyle project, but it's all the same kind of information. We've got our driver here, the path to the driver itself. We're connecting to Enterprise, our web server URL. We've got our API key, our site ID, and then our optional parameters around, again, when do we want the build to fail, confidence rating, severity rating, what kind of report do we want, where do we want that stored, and again, there's some documentation around the optional parameters of which we can build out further options there as well. But again, once that pipeline runs, it's just sending that API request back to Enterprise. If I jump into my scans here, I can see that it's kicked off that API scan. But again, the developer doesn't need to look at this. Look at the console output in the pipeline and then generate that report for him or herself. Anything we need to add to that, Adam? You happy?
No, I think that's everything covered off. Thank you very much. So to wrap up, apologies for coughing as well today. We've got a couple of next steps and asks that we'd love you to take through. If you're able to skip on to the next slide, Alex. Now, appreciate and thank you very much for answering the poll at the beginning of the session. I can see that some of you are at different stages with your journey of Enterprise Edition. But depending on where you are, we've got a couple of asks. So basically, if you haven't deployed, please take a look at the preparation guidance. Kieran obviously dropped it in the chat at the beginning of the session, but we'll follow up on email. So if you've not deployed, please check that out and get started with Enterprise Edition. If you have deployed, what we'd often suggest, as Alex mentioned, get plenty of tech support cases coming through that are related to system requirements. So we recommend that you check out the system requirements, and the new doc should be live in the next week or so, and make sure that you're up to spec. Once you're in the product, get those first scans run and start to build up a picture of the vulnerabilities in your apps. Please share it with colleagues and users. Make sure that you're getting the reports and the remediation advice out to the right people. We are here to support. It's often forgot because we don't charge any extra for it, that support is available with Enterprise Edition, so it would be fantastic if you could follow up if you are having any issues, and we'd love to hear about it and love to solve those issues. Just launched a quick 2-question poll at the end. We'd love to understand whether you found value in today's session, and whether you'd like to book a session in 2023 for us to support your organisation with that rollout. Thank you very much for attending today. It was really appreciated. We're going to stay live for 10 minutes or so. Turn the video and put mute on so I can have a good cough. But we're here to finish off any Q&As. We should get all of the follow-ups out to you. If not tomorrow, it'll be Friday. We've got a couple of other dependencies, but we'll get those to you. And if you'd like to attend a session in the new year, then we'd love to have you. So thank you very much. Thank you, Alex. Thanks to all the team.
Thanks all.
And we'll see you soon.